All right, so today we're going to cover 1.5, which is about solving equations, and we're going to solve quadratic equations using methods that you've done before, but we might need to refresh with some of them, completing the square, factoring, and then the quadratic formula. Okay, so I have you guys do the first one. So the first step is to get everything on one side so that you have this value equal to 0. Once you have something equal to 0, okay, if you rewrite it as a product, that means one of these has to be 0 because anything times 0 is 0. Okay, so we're going to start with x and x. If you need to, you can do what we call a T-chart where you're listing the different values that go into 32. So I just start with 1, 2, 3 doesn't go in there, 4 goes in there 8 times, 5 no, 6, 7, and then you're back at 8. Okay, so it has to combine to a positive 4. So you're looking for the difference. One has to be positive 8, one has to be negative 4. And then because of that 0 product property, you can set up these two equations. This only happens when the product is 0. So if you have this equal to a number, you couldn't set that because it doesn't have the same properties as 0. Okay? And then you don't have to show like the minus. I'm okay if you just say this. It's either x is equal to negative 8 or x is equal to 4. Just be careful. Just try to avoid those small mistakes. If you feel better like writing out what that step is to make sure you have the right sign, that is absolutely fine. Okay, so solve by factoring, and then you're going to use all the factoring methods that we've been working on for the past week. All right, completing the square is usually the one that people need the most remembering on. So we have x squared plus, we're going to call this bx, where b is a number, okay, plus blank equals. So when you are completing the square, you have to make sure that you have a coefficient. I'm going to write that here. A coefficient of 1 on x squared. Okay, so it's the a value. So sometimes you might see it written as the a value is equal to 1. Okay, once you have that, you're going to have a blank space that you have to fill in. To do that, it's half of b squared. Okay, and then it's going to equal some value c. Okay, and we add it to each side. B over 2 squared. Then what you do is you factor. This, when you're completing the square, is going to be a perfect square trinomial. Okay, it's going to be in factored form. It is a perfect square trinomial, which is a pattern that we've talked about. So when you end up factoring this, and I'm going to show you some examples with numbers as well. I just want to make sure we understand how this works. You're going to have x plus, and then whatever this b over 2, is what goes in the factored form. Okay, and then from there, we're just going to solve. So we would simplify this side. All right, so let's see what that looks like with this value. So your c value is the constant. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to add 11 over. At this step, I do put like the plus blanks so that you can see what you're filling in. Okay, so we're going to take half of b and square it. That's what's going to go in here. So the b value is -6. Usually we do the half part in our head, right? So half of -6 is -3. And what I usually do is I write it like this here. You could also put +9, that's fine. You can decide which one you want to do. Okay, and then what you're doing is factoring this. So I'm just going to show you a few things. If you were to factor x squared minus 6x plus 9, okay, it would factor into x and x what multiplies to 9 but adds to -6. -3 and -3. Yep. So if it's the same value, the way that we write that in factored form would be x minus 3 squared. Okay, I'm going to take a second while I think about that factoring. Okay, so the reason why I write it as -3 squared is because you're always going to have that value of b over 2 here. And so to me, if I write it out like this and factor, that just takes a little bit longer when I know what the end result's going to be. Okay, you can do it whichever way you feel comfortable. And then on this side, we're just going to add those together. So 11 plus 9 is 20, so it's going to be equal to 20. Okay, so on this side, you're always going to write it in factored form. That's what's happening. In the past, sometimes I have people say, well, what happened to the 9? Well, nothing happened to it. We're just rewriting it in a different form, right? If we were to FOIL that out, we'd get the same thing. Okay, the reason why we want to write it in this form is so we can do what? What's my next step? I heard somebody say it. Yeah, you're going to take the square root, right? So once you have it in this form, we're going to take the square root of both sides. I'm going to write it like this so in your notes you can see. Okay, so you're going to take the square root of both sides because the square root undoes the 2. So then you just have x minus 3 equals. And then here's another thing that people usually forget. Remember, when you take the square root, in front has to go the plus or minus. Okay, and then we are going to simplify the radical. Always simplify radicals. Okay, so the perfect square in 20 is 4, which is going to take it to 2 root 5. Okay, you can factor tree with that one. It's just a lot easier to remember, oh, if I have the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, 4 times 5 is 20, square root of 4 is 2, root 5, plus u, plus u. Okay, and then our last step is going to be add 3. So when you write out your final answer here, this value is going to go in front. So it'll be a positive 3 plus or minus 2 root 5. Okay, we always want to leave our answers as exact values. Okay, so exact value means we aren't going to be having decimals here. Let's continue. Okay, so for part B, let's try that. So our first step is going to add over the 7/4. Okay, and I always like to put like my blank spot here. Remember when you're moving it over that you do change the sign if you're not writing that stuff out. And then if you have an odd value, remember it's just b over 2 squared. Okay, that's what we're adding to each side. So this is my b value, 3 over 2 squared. And then when you have a fraction, you just square the top, square the bottom. 3 squared is 9. Yep, 2 squared is 4. Okay, and I want you to see if you can write that in factored form and the other side. I know it might be going a little fast for some people today. It's just because It is review. Okay, and then whenever you are adding with a common denominator stays the same, you add the top together. Okay, this does simplify to 4. If you get something that doesn't simplify, you would take the square root of the top and the bottom. Okay, so it's not always going to work out where this is going to be a whole number, but that's okay. Okay, you can always square root the top and the bottom of a fraction. If I were to square root 16 over 4, okay, I would end up with 4 over 2, which is going to be the same thing that we're going to get here. But if you have something where the top doesn't simplify, that's okay. Again, don't forget that plus or minus. Okay, and then I have x plus 3 over 2. Now, these are whole numbers. This is a whole number here. This is going to be a fraction, but I don't have any irrational numbers that I have to deal with, so I am going to find these two solutions. So my two solutions are 2 minus 3 over 2 and negative 2 minus 3 over 2. Okay, so we can do that. You can either get a common denominator and subtract, like 2 times 2, right? Or, remember, 3 over 2 is just 1.5. So what's 2 minus 1.5? Just a half, right? So we can do that. Or like I said, you can do times 2 times 2. 4 minus 3 is 1. The denominator stays the same. Okay, so then I want you to try to simplify that if you haven't already. So again, if you're going the common denominator route, negative 4 minus 3 is negative 7 over 2. Okay, or you can think of it as negative 2 minus 1.5 is negative 3.5. Okay, you can leave it as negative 3.5, or you can leave it as negative 7 over 2. Okay, either one of those is going to be fine. All right, any questions for me on completing the square? All right, so notice that in example 2, and I should have highlighted this for us, it says to solve by completing the square. Okay, example 1 said solve by factoring. So in the directions, if it tells you how to solve, I want you to solve that way for your homework. Okay, this one just says solve. So you can choose how you want to solve unless the directions say otherwise. Okay, so there's multiple ways to do this one. Okay, if you have squared, you could FOIL that out, and then you could factor or complete the square. But if you are here with the square, remember when we did completing the square? When we got here, what was our first step? Yep, so I would just take the square root. That's going to be the quickest method. So then you have x plus 5 equals plus or minus root 3. You add the 5 over. And there you go. Okay, for this one, I'm going to show you how to do this with completing the square because I want you to know what to do if you don't have sorry, I don't want to do that. I want to do plus 4 if I'm doing completing the square. I'm going to show you how to do completing the square if you don't have an a value of 1. Okay, but you can choose whatever you want when you're doing this on your homework. Okay, so if we add that over, and we have 2x squared minus 3x. If you don't have a 1 there, you can still use completing the square by dividing everything by 2. If you do that, okay, if you do that, then you can complete the square once that's a 1. Okay? And again, I want to show you this so if you run into it during the completing the square section, you know what to do with this. If you're cutting a fraction in half, it's a lot easier to take that and instead of dividing by 2, multiply by a half. Okay, so don't be intimidated by a fraction here. Okay, all we have to do is multiply by 1/2, and then we would get -3/4, and then we're squaring that. Okay, so for this one, b over 2 is -3 over 2 times 1/2. So if you have a fraction, we're just going to multiply by a half. And then on this side, we would get positive 9 over 16. Okay, and then just like we did before, we're going to get a common denominator. So times 8 times 8. Take this up here. And this is why I like leaving it like this, because I'm not going to want to factor that trinomial. I just want to be able to drop that b value in there, x minus 3/4 squared. And that's going to equal 8 plus 9, which is 17 over 16. Okay, so I added b over 2 to each side. I wrote this in factored form. Then I'm ready to take the square root. So I have x minus 3/4 equals, and then I'm going to put my plus or minus. And remember, if you have a fraction, this is the same thing as doing the square root of the numerator over the square root of the denominator. So the square root of the numerator isn't going to simplify, but this does, right? The square root of 16 is 4. And then your last step is going to be to move that over. So you have 3/4 plus or minus root 17 over 4. Okay, so you couldn't have factored this because you have the square root. Okay, what would be another good choice for b for solving? The square. Yeah, the quadratic formula. Okay, and honestly, if you do see a 2 in front, I would use the quadratic formula. Okay, and so that's what we're going to do for C. Do you guys remember what the quadratic formula is? What's the first part? What's the first part? Opposite of b, yep, or minus b.
No, it's b squared minus 4ac?
Yep. Divided by 2a. There we go. Teamwork makes the dream work. Okay, and this time it's a y, so it really is going to be y equals instead of our x equals. So your a is 2, your b is -1, your c is -1/2. Okay, this is another no calculator unit. And really all of chapter 1 is no calculator, and then in chapter 2 we will be using this. I always say the opposite of b, that way if it's negative you just change it. And I like to do the b squared in my head. So 1 squared is 1 minus 4ac. I always write that out instead of trying to do it in my head to make sure I have the right signs. Because when you're multiplying, you have to remember if there's always a negative here. So if this is negative, okay, it's going to change into a positive. And then, so that I don't have to write it over 100 times, I usually just write at the top like 1 plus. So what's 4 times 2? 8. What's 8 times a half? 4. So it's just 1 plus 4 underneath there. Okay, so we would write that as 1 plus or minus root 5 over 4. Okay, and you can leave your answer like this. Sometimes you're going to be able to simplify. Okay, so I recommend that you write your answer as these 2 separate terms here. That way, if it does simplify, you can make sure you don't forget to do the simplify. Sometimes only one will simplify. You always want to reduce. Okay, so the way that we've learned, the first one is factor. We've done complete the square, and we've done the quadratic formula. So if it doesn't tell you which way to do it, you have those. Now, 2 and 3 have to be used when you have irrational roots. Okay, and always leave your answers in simplest radical form, which means it's an exact value. Okay, so you have 10 homework problems that you are going to work on in class today and hopefully finish. It's on page 55. And again, you do need to follow the directions, but number 53 is in the section where it says to factor. Do not factor it. Use another method, okay? Okay, so there are 10 problems total. And then that is mandatory.